işgalcilere ülkemizi asla bırakmayacağız.
Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Turkey is still reeling 1 week after a major coup attempt left at least 270 people dead. The events of July 15th catapulted the nation into a state of uncertainty, tragedy, and resolve. Since then, citizens have continued to pour out onto the streets in support of democracy, and the government has taken several measures to get to the bottom of the failed attempt, including arresting thousands of people and declaring a nationwide state of emergency. On today's special edition of the Newsmakers, we look at Turkey's failed coup 1 week on.
It was unclear initially what exactly was happening. Not long after 10 in the evening local time, tanks were rolling onto the streets in Ankara and blocking the bridges over the Bosphorus in Istanbul. Very soon reports were coming in of gunshots in Ankara, with military jets and helicopters in the air. Helicopters also were buzzing Istanbul. Within an hour, the Prime Minister was appealing for calm, while saying an attempted coup was underway. In the next hour, the momentum swung between the pro-coup soldiers and the government. By this time, it was unclear where President Erdogan was. News was filtering through that soldiers had entered the buildings of the national broadcaster, TRT, in Ankara and Istanbul, while a newsreader was reading a statement on television on the orders of the military that martial law and a curfew was being imposed. Social media came to the aid of the president. Speaking to a TV channel via the presenter's iPhone, he urged the people onto the streets, a clip that was quickly spread far and wide. As people gathered, primarily at Taksim Square and on the Bosphorus Bridge in Istanbul, they faced off against tanks and soldiers. Guns and tanks fired against the crowds. By the end of the night, many would have died on the bridge. Reports came in that a military helicopter had opened fire in Ankara. Explosions were heard in the capital, and tanks surrounded the parliament. F-16 jets buzzed Istanbul and Ankara. In the early hours, the fight back began. Fighter jets shot down a military helicopter, reportedly part of the coup, whilst a statement of support for the government was issued by the United States. However, jets continued to fly low over Istanbul, creating terrifying sonic booms. By 3 in the morning, the president was back in Istanbul. At least 2 fighter jets followed his plane over the Sea of Marmara.
Let me say that what happened is treason. The people responsible for it will receive a heavy penalty for their treason. They did not respect this nation's decisions, evident in their votes. They betrayed the official elected government and the president, who by our constitution is their commander-in-chief. This is not going to end as they hoped.
Within hours, soldiers involved in the attempted coup surrendered on one of the bridges across the Bosphorus in Istanbul, abandoning their tanks, and many faced the wrath of the crowd. Whilst armed police surrounded and arrested about 30 soldiers at Taksim Square. In Ankara, pockets of pro-coup soldiers held out, while Turkey's intelligence headquarters was attacked by helicopters and machine gun fire. In the cold light of day, Turkey woke up to the reality. Pictures of the dead and wounded were shared and posted online. From Ankara, there were images of serious damage to the Turkish parliament.
Friday night, July 15th, is a black stain for Turkey. Turkish people stood on guard for democracy against this parallel terrorist organization that attempted to stage a coup.
In total, over 200 people lost their lives that night. Hundreds were injured, while 24 pro-coup soldiers were reported to have been killed. The blame for the coup was directed towards the former cleric and businessman Fethullah Gulen, who's lived in self-imposed exile in the United States since 1999. He denied any involvement. On Saturday, almost 3,000 military personnel with alleged ties to the Gulen organization were detained, and 2,745 judges were dismissed. Over the next few days, the number of people arrested and detained began to mount. And so did the number of people suspended. Turkey says that Gulen's followers had infiltrated the state institutions, not only the military. In total, more than 60,000 people have been suspended or detained. As the week progressed, Turkey began proceedings requesting Gulen's extradition from the United States. By Thursday, 6 days after the coup attempt, the country was under a state of emergency. Francis Collins, The Newsmakers.
Joining me here in the studio for a look back at the week since the coup attempt is Ahmet Yükleyen. He is a professor of political science and international relations at Istanbul Commerce University. And in Beirut is Jana Jabur. She is a research associate at the Paris Institute of Political Studies, also known as Sciences Po Paris. Thanks both so much for joining us. With 7 days of hindsight in tow, let me just establish where both of you stand today. How do you see the events of July 15th, Ahmet?
This has been a historic test of the Turkish people's belief in democracy. And what we see is that, yes, as Turkish people of all walks of life, we have passed this test. Now, it doesn't mean that the test is over, but definitely the very resilience, the very internalization, if you will, of the belief in democracy, Turkish people have accomplished this. This is a big success, and we definitely have to take the necessary steps to take this further, this common belief in democracy. That is, I think, the most important lesson we've gotten out of this. And of course, those who have tested this, now it's their time to be on trial. So as long as the Turkish people continue in their belief for asking for democracy, they will be able to pass this test and the next stages of this test as well.
Okay, Jana?
Yes, in fact, I fully agree with Ahmed. I think what happened was a historical moment. It was historical in two main respects. First of all, for the first time in the history of Turkey, we saw people taking to the streets in order to defend their civilian government against military tutelage. And as you know, the history of Turkey is marked by many coups d'etats. Almost every 10 years since the 1960s, there has been a coup d'etat, and all of these coups d'etats have succeeded because the people were scared to demonstrate against the military. What is new today is that this wall of fear has fallen. What is new is that the people have acquired a sort of democratic consciousness. They have acquired this consciousness through the past decade in the 2000s, and thanks to the reforms that the ruling party, the AKP, has implemented in the context of the accession negotiations to the EU. This is one. And second point is that this was a historical moment because we saw the opposition putting aside its disagreements and its antagonism with the government in order to side with the civilian parties, with the civilian government against the military. So said differently, for the first time, we saw the opposition taking to the streets to defend a government they despise just in order to save democracy. And let me tell you that watching this from the Middle East, from an Arab country, I can say that now more than ever before, Turkey is back to being a model for the Middle East, especially a model for all these Arab countries who are experiencing very complex civil military relations and who are from time to time subject to a military takeover, like for example in Egypt when Abdel Fattah al-Sisi took over power through a coup d'etat against the elected government of Morsi. So I think this is a momentum for Turkey to capitalize on, to regain some prestige and a very positive image in its neighborhood.
Okay. I'd like to step back to the night itself. You were here.
Yes.
Can you describe a moment, something that happened when the shock actually hit you of what this really was?
Well, I guess most like others, this was it looked like a very usual night. I was watching TV, actually, as a matter of fact, of a debate, and in the middle of the debate, all these pictures of soldiers And the first thing, of course, that came to my mind was, of course, things that have been happening in Nice, in other places. So it must be some kind of a terrorist attack, by ISIS or others. Of course, once you then hear about the tanks moving in, and then, and of course, especially the jets flying over in Ankara, well, then, the color of things have started changing quite rapidly. Of course, I have to admit, this is my first time experience. I've read, other stuff about the coup in 1980. I was very little then. This was, of course, live unfolding. But I have to add, and I think, if I compare the flow of events during a coup, let's say, attempt, with the ones that have happened in Turkey, clearly these were trying the methods of those that have tried in the 1980. And of course, we live in a different world. Let's keep it in mind. FaceTime is in place. We have social media in place. We have people that have the resilience. And here I have to point out that actually Turkish people have learned a lot from the experiences of asking for more democracy in the Middle East as well. Especially with the last reference in Egypt. So clearly there is a learning process for the people in this part of the world, and of course they do it with technology-savvy kind of characters and methods, and that's produced this kind of result.
Tell me about that, though, and I want to get your personal take on that.
Sure.
That moment when you actually saw the president on an iPhone with that little microphone being held up to the anchor's personal phone with just a curtain behind him.
Yes.
There was a slight air of shock in his face, to say the least. What went through your mind?
Of course, I think like many others, I was shocked. I was shocked to believe this. That is, of course, when you clearly understand, this is not just, something else. It's not just a terrorist attack from outside. This is, of course, before those images we have seen, of course, Prime Minister also actually saying that and putting the name that this is a coup attempt and so forth. That was also very critical. But of course, everybody's eyes were looking for, minds, hearts were looking for the president. Where is the president? And those pictures, I think, was also a great sense of relief. But I think, as you pointed out, that image was also sending a sense of shock throughout the country.
I want to move on. Jana, let me turn to you for this. Some government supporters, as you are aware, had said that they tried to warn Turkey's foreign allies of certain dangers in Turkey and that they really weren't listened to. Do you think that's true? What do you make of that now in hindsight?
Well, honestly speaking, I am appalled and shocked when I hear European leaders or sometimes some American leaders criticizing Turkey and the decision of the president to reinstate a state of emergency, while these governments are themselves, democratic governments, and they shouldn't be really criticizing the elected government in Turkey. They should be rather condemning explicitly and outwardly this coup. So I'm really shocked by that, and I think that this reluctance of European leaders to immediately take a stance with Recep Tayyip Erdogan and with the elected government is causing a certain Euroscepticism today in Turkey. People are simply disappointed, frustrated, deceived by the slow reaction of European and American capitals.
Given what Jana was just explaining and the perhaps disillusionment of some Turks with Europe itself, do you think that in part played into what some saw as a kind of shocking suspension of the European Convention on Human Rights in the aftermath of the coup, or do you think it's entirely justified?
Let's keep this in mind. This is this is not just any type of coup. That's another point that most people are missing. There is a very clandestine faction that is not just in the military, by the way. We've seen, other kind of arms of this organization. So under these circumstances, it definitely requires to take very extraordinary measures. And we have seen this happen in France. Of course, we don't want to compare the big kind of, let's say, shocking events in France with those in Turkey. But we have to understand that if any European country can declare a state of emergency, and like a well-established democracy like France can do this, why not? Why should this be a source of criticism for Turkey? What's important is that, these are all within the boundaries of law, and as long as these are applied in accordance with law, that's the only way to get, really rid of this, a threat of this size. So, putting pressure on Turkey for international law, international human rights, those things are already being followed up in Turkey.
In essence, Turkey could go forward with reinstating the death penalty, and certain rules, for example, in the convention itself, no longer have to be abided by. Do you think that is a good thing for Turkey in the immediate aftermath and going forward in the future?
Well, of course, this debate of a special death penalty issue has been debated before. As we all know, the leader of PKK, once he was captured, this was debated. Of course, once this, and of course now emotions are very high. If we actually listen to the people in the crowds, we see these kind of chantings. On the other hand, if we listen to the politicians, we see a more cautious. Yes, we will take into consideration the demand of the people, but, this will be a decision that will be taken together in the assembly, and we will not act with revenge, but with reason and with justice. Those are the very strong indicators that Turkey, as a whole, with all its different political parties, will take the right steps as we move forward.
Okay, Ahmed, I'm just going to ask you to hold it there, because we're going to turn to a report from one of our correspondents. As we mentioned, the coup attempt had a significant human toll, with many declaring the Turkish citizens, especially those who lost their lives, as the real heroes of the night. Here's a look. We just saw the pictures of some of the more than 200 victims that lost their lives in this coup attempt. How does that make you feel about the state of Turkey right now? Not just the deaths of those hundreds of people, but the detention of some 60,000 Turkish citizens.
Look, as I pointed out, Turkey is going through very extraordinary times. Yes, we had coups, but not of this kind. Yes, we had trials, but not of this level. The main thing that we have to do as a people, as the Turkish people, of all beliefs, of all walks of life, is to come together on common grounds. And that is the ground of democracy, rule of law, and the belief, if you will, the common will to move forward. Now, in order to do that, you do have to take extraordinary steps. That is totally understandable. Now, the important thing is, as you execute these extraordinary measures, you really have to act with caution, because there is no other country that we will go and live. And the differences that we have will continue to remain there. So we have to learn to live with differences within the law, and those who are responsible in any way, in this coup attempt, one way or another, have to really be brought to justice. Now, all these things are unfolding very quickly, and I know that the public statements have been very much pointing out that this is not a time of revenge, but a time of justice. So as long as the execution of these policies also follow this goal, this principle, I think we'll be a much stronger democracy in the near future.
Okay. Jana, 60,000 people suspended or detained for alleged involvement. I want to ask you how you think that affects the organization of the state. And as a Turkey analyst, are you concerned with the state of the Turkish bureaucracy and its security?
Well, first of all, let's say that any state of emergency in any state would actually lead to extraordinary exceptional measures, including these mass arrests of people without prior justification, including also taking away some of the prerogatives of the judiciary and legislative bodies and transferring them to the executive power, including also some restrictions on the freedom of movement and the freedom of speech of people. Of course, any state of emergency with these measures might pave the way for abuses and might pave the way for democratic backsliding. Now, in order for the Turkish government now to avoid this slippery slope and to avoid democratic backsliding, what they need to do is, first of all, to ensure that these trials, that these arrests are considered as a legal process, a legal procedure, and not a political one. It's not about taking revenge. It's just about ensuring that all these people are judged in a due process. Also, what needs to be done is to make sure that this state of emergency has limited damage on the population in terms of guaranteeing freedoms. And thirdly, what needs to be done, and here I'm back to Ahmed's point, is that this process should be transparent and it should be swift. You need to decide very quickly on whether these 15,000 people that you detained are really and explicitly and directly linked to the coup d'etat or not. And if not, they should be released as soon as possible.
Jana, we've heard from government officials that the state of emergency will last 3 months. We've even heard it might last only 45 days. Do you think that will be the case? Are you confident that this can be brought under control in that relatively short period of time?
Well, taking into consideration the declarations of the president and the declaration of the Turkish government and the speaker of the parliament, who said that we are not taking revenge, we're not trying to, bypass laws and bypass the constitution. Everything we're trying to do is to make sure that we purge the state of these coup plotters and perpetrators as soon as possible. Taking that into consideration, I do believe that the government is being rational about how to treat this coup d'etat. And I do believe that if the Turkish government really wants to remain part of the European Union, or actually continue its negotiations with the European Union, and continue to being a respected player on the international scene, a respected actor in world politics, then definitely they need to be very cautious and they need to be very rational in this process.
Ahmed, you agree with Jana there?
Fully, I have to say, because Jana really pointed out, in a way, the roadmap to make sure that, this process can unfold in the way it should. Those who are responsible should be brought to justice. Those who are not, they should go on with their lives. I know this is very difficult times, and it's not easy to actually solve these, to make these distinctions. As long as these are carried out with principles and as transparent as it can be, I think that's the way to move forward. Otherwise, that definitely will not. As a matter of fact, this could actually help. By the way, those who have attempted this coup, because that's the only thing they have in their hands left is to divide, the people along, sectarian lines, along ethnic lines. And the way to do that is to use any kind of injustice, if it happens, in the country to provoke people. So that's yet another level, as I pointed out in the beginning, other tests are ahead.
Not just for the people, though. What about the politicians? One of the most beautiful things we saw in the immediate aftermath of this coup attempt was the unity across the board of all parliamentarians and all of Turkey's leading parties.
Yes.
Do you expect that honestly to continue?
I think we should all work for that to continue and to get stronger. And not only at the political level, I have to add, but also at the civil society level. You know, I know that there's actually, there are reasons to be hopeful that this will continue and even get stronger. Just in the upcoming days, there will be a big demonstration that will be organized by the main opposition party. And, you know, the representatives of the current ruling party have declared that they will join this, this meeting in support of Turkey's democracy. We need more examples of this kind, especially at the civil society level, especially people who are known to have different opinions should come together on the commonality that we all want a stronger democracy in this country for all.
Jana, final words?
Yes, in fact, I do think that today there's a sort of rally around the flag in Turkey, a sort of rally around the president effect as well. And I think there is here a moment for the Turkish government, for the Turkish ruling party to capitalize on in order to embrace all segments of Turkish society and in order to embrace the opposition. As we said earlier, the opposition took a historical stance by standing with the government. And now, today, it is the moment for Recep Tayyip Erdogan to show flexibility, to show tolerance, and to show moderation vis-à-vis all segments of society, but mainly vis-à-vis the opposition. And if he does that, then he will prove to the world that he deserves to rule this country.
Jana, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for sharing your insight, joining us from Beirut, Lebanon. And Ahmed, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. That brings us to an end of our program. You've been watching this special edition of the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.